It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
When this dead hand moves, the monster created by a man they called mad is turned loose to strike terror into the hearts of men. To shock women into uncontrolled hysteria.
Elizabeth!
To prey upon the innocence of children. This is the story you've heard about, talked about. The spine-tingling, blood-chilling story that stuns your emotions. Frankenstein.
Don't touch that!
Bem-vindos a mais uma sessão do Mês da Ciência e da Educação, uma iniciativa da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, comissariada pelo professor Carlos Fiolhais e pelo Dr. David Marçal. Hoje começamos com imagens de um clássico da ficção científica, o filme Frankenstein, que há quase 90 anos falava de um cientista louco que junta diversas partes de cadáveres para construir um novo corpo humano. A figura do cientista não fica muito bem vista neste filme. Ora, hoje em dia, os cientistas também não gozam de muito boa imagem junto de uma parte da população. Há pessoas que perguntam porquê é que devemos acreditar nos cientistas e na ciência? E este é o tema da nossa sessão de hoje. Porquê confiar na ciência? Why trust science? This is a question many people ask. Naomi Oreskes joins us from Cambridge, Massachusetts, United States, and will help us answer this question. Hi, Professor Oreskes, thank you for joining us. Let me tell you, people, that Naomi Oreskes is an American distinguished historian of science. She develops research within the fields of philosophy of science and sociology of science, also a professor of science at Harvard University. Professor, one of your main concerns is the role of science in society. Am I right?
Yes, definitely.
Why is that? Why is so important science for society?
I think we've seen this year in very clear terms why science is so important. We faced this year a new virus, a virus that was not understood or known when it first emerged back in December in China. And in order to come to grips with this new threat, we have to understand the science. We have to understand the character of the virus. We have to understand how pandemics spread. And those countries who have taken the scientific evidence seriously, who have listened to scientific expertise, and who have done testing and contact tracing have done a much better job of controlling the virus, seen much less illness, many fewer deaths than countries like my own, the United States, where scientific knowledge and scientific advice have been cavalierly disregarded.
Okay, with me in studio is Dr. David Marçal. Thank you for being as well. He's a chemist, biochemist and science communicator, and we'll talk with you and with me about this question, why trust science? Last year, you published this book titled Why Trust Science, exactly. If we ask why, it's because some people do not trust science. I mean, we must find reasons to justify this trust. Did you find the key to convince people to trust science?
Well, I don't know because I haven't done a research project among my readers, but I can say the book is doing very well. I have it right here. I'm happy to say It's selling well. We have a paperback coming out shortly, and I believe an edition in Portugal as well.
Yes.
So let me say something about why I wrote the book and what I was hoping to achieve. So I didn't write the book thinking that this would convince climate change deniers or people who reject vaccines. Rather, my goal was a bit different than that. Because of my work on climate science and the problem of climate change, I've given hundreds of public lectures, both in the United States and around the world. And in those lectures, I try to explain as clearly as I can to my audiences what the science is that makes us concerned about climate change, what kind of work scientists do, why they have come to the conclusions they have, and why this is an issue that we should be concerned about. And sometimes when I give talks like this, I found at the end of the talk, someone would stand up and they would say something like, well, that's all very well and good, but why should we trust the science? And I thought, well, it's not a bad question. Even if sometimes the question was being offered in bad faith, the basic question is a good one. I don't think that in a democracy, we should just say to people, you have to trust us, we're the experts, you don't have the right to ask questions. No, of course not. In a democracy, in a free society, we should be willing and able to engage with the public and to explain what is the basis for trust in science. And so what I decided to do was to see if I could write, in not too many pages, a principled, sensible argument that any ordinary educated person could read that would give an account of why we have some reason to trust science.
Who do you say is the audience for this book? Are the common people or the scientists themselves?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I'd say it's both. I'd say my primary audience are ordinary people who might want to have a better understanding of what is the basis for scientific conclusions. How does the scientific process work? So in that sense, I would say most scientists wouldn't really need to read the book. It would be more targeted at ordinary lay people. However, that said, I have learned in my own experience through my own work, my career, many scientists have a view of science that actually does not stand up to historical or philosophical scrutiny. So many scientists hold a kind of great man vision of science, that the reason we should trust science is because scientists are geniuses. History doesn't really support that conclusion. And many scientists will say that we should trust science because scientists follow the scientific method. So in the book, I examine those premises. I show why they don't really hold up to scrutiny. And I give what I think is a more defensible account so that scientists can actually give an account of their own work that would stand up to scrutiny.
David, I think you have read already the book or parts of the book in English, and let me tell you that, as you said, Professor, the Portuguese version will be available, I think, next year in January. So, David, you have read the book. What did you take from the book?
Yes, I think Professor Naomi Oreskes makes a pretty convincing argument. I think the central, I would say, the more strong aspect of your book, I think, is your emphasis on the social nature of the scientific knowledge and how that can assure that it is reliable, because it does not depend only on one person, a genius in a basement like the one that makes Frankenstein. Actually, the scientific work is highly scrutinized. It is not based on not committing mistakes, but in founding them and correcting them. So I think if I understood correctly, the central point of why should we trust science, it's because it is a collective, it is made by a community of scientists that compete and cooperate with each other. I would argue, or as I understand. So I think that is very important. I think from historical point of view, as you surely know better than I, modern science only was made possible after we have the press, the possibility of printing books and distributing them to a large extent so that millions of people could have access to the scientific results and actually scrutinize them. So,
David, you know well the Portuguese reality. Do you think how do you think this book will be, the Portuguese version, will be received by the Portuguese society?
I think at this point, at this moment, I hope it will be. I think it is an important book. I think we are asking these questions because this COVID-19 situation creates a kind of schizophrenia situation, because people actually look up to science for answers, like a vaccine or a treatment, but yet a lot of mistrust in science persists. So there are a lot of conspiracy theories, there are a lot of misinformation or disinformation, which are sometimes as very important and very influent supporters, the misinformation. So I think at this moment, where science is more is highly focused because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think people need to be reassured on why they should and can trust science, although science, it's not perfect because it's made by human beings who are not perfect and commit errors. But science is a very robust process which, after a certain time, allow us to find and correct these errors through, as Professor Naomi says, to the interaction of a community of scientists.
Do you agree, Professor?
Absolutely. That was an incredibly wonderful summary. I wish I could take David with me when I travel and lecture. That might be the best summary I've heard. So I would just reiterate two key things that I think he said that are absolutely correct. So the first one has to do with the social character of science. And this would be one reason why I would want scientists to read this book. When sociologists and anthropologists, people like Bruno Latour and others, began talking extensively about the social character of science back in the late 80s and 90s, many scientists took that as an attack on science, as if it was saying that somehow science was not objective because it was social. And I think that was a gross misinterpretation of what we actually know about the social character of science. So part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to take that criticism and flip it on its head and say, in fact, the social character of the science is the strength of it, because it doesn't depend, as David just said, on one scientist in his basement, in his garage, in his attic, and it doesn't rely on the individual scientist to be perfect, or to never make a mistake, but rather it relies on the community of scientists to identify error and correct it. And it's that critical scrutiny from many different angles that gives the likelihood of a good response. And I love the fact that you used the Frankenstein movie. I love that movie. I used it in my courses. I've taught the original book by Mary Shelley, and it's very evocative and I think very telling that Dr. Frankenstein works more or less alone up in a tower, isolated from society. And it's that very isolation that permits him to go, essentially off the rails.
Okay, I think later we'll talk again about this COVID issue. But now I would like to remember the other book you authored some years ago, Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscure the Truth on Issues from Tobacco to Global Warming. I mean, that's why you are telling that scientists should also read this book, because sometimes it's not the people's fault. Scientists also do mistakes, right?
Absolutely. So scientists do go off the rails. That's the Frankenstein story. And to some extent, it's also the Merchants of Doubt story. In that story, we profiled 4 scientists who were prominent individuals, very intelligent, very highly educated people, but who were not climate scientists, but who decided to challenge climate science. And so one of the arguments that comes out of that book and helps to inform the new book is that if an individual scientist makes a claim that is at odds with what the larger community of scientists have to say, in general, we should view that skeptically. Now, it's not to say that an individual is never right, or to say that the larger community is never wrong. Of course, that's possible. But in general, it's the critical scrutiny, it's the community process that yields reliable results. And what was particularly suspicious about the Merchants of Doubt, and should have been a red flag to anyone who was listening to them, was that they were not taking their complaints into the halls of science and engaging in an open and honest conversation with their fellow scientists. Rather, they were taking the argument outside the halls of science, going to the mass media, working with politically motivated think tanks, accepting funding in some cases from the fossil fuel industry. And those should all be red flags that these men were not operating as scientists normally do operate.
But still, there are still people that don't believe that there are global warming. I mean, perhaps they believe there is global warming, but about the people is the attitudes of the people that influence the global warming. Do you think now with COVID something similar is happening? I mean, also some scientists are telling, no, this is normal, or are just the politicians who are doing this discourse?
Well, what we showed in Emergence of Doubt in that book was that it wasn't exactly surprising that many people were confused about climate change, because in fact, we were able to show, to document a 40-year campaign whose whole purpose was to confuse people about climate science, to make us think that we didn't really know whether the science was correct or not, and therefore that we should not take steps to act on climate change. And what we showed in the book was that the people who made those claims were deeply motivated by conservative political ideology, by hostility to what they like to call big government, and that those same people, the exact same people, had been involved in campaigns to discredit the science that proved that using tobacco, smoking tobacco, was lethal, that it could kill you. So that was a sort of, again, a red flag that this was not a normal scientific debate. If we look now at COVID-19, it's a more complicated problem because COVID-19 has many more dimensions, including the urgency of having to deal with a pandemic that is breaking out right now. We're talking about something here and now, not something in the future. But we have seen, particularly here in the United States, but also in England and other places as well, a similar kind of politicization by conservatives who don't want the government to be involved in the marketplace, or who don't want the government to be taking strong steps to protect people from harms. And so these same people have raised confusion about whether we should wear masks, raised confusion about whether it's appropriate to stay home, to practice social distancing. And here in the United States, just this week, we saw the issuance of a declaration. It was called the Great Barrington Declaration. It was very similar to similar kinds of declarations we have seen on climate change. Many years ago, there was something called the Heidelberg Declaration. And this declaration is really flying in the face of the majority or consensus view of public health officials, saying that, we should just go about our business and develop herd immunity, not stay home, not wear masks, not practice social distancing. And similar to what we've seen before, if we look at who's organizing and who's funding it, it's being heavily funded by the fossil fuel industry, by the Coke industries, and by conservative think tanks who promote the ideology of limited governance. So we're seeing the role of ideology, political ideology, from the right wing of the political spectrum being used to create confusion about what the right scientific advice is and what the robust scientific evidence is.
Yes, David, yes.
I think that from Margins of Doubt and also by your intervention, it is clear that sometimes there is a social controversy that has no parallel with the scientific controversy. So there is a social controversy which creates the illusion of a scientific controversy that and that confusion has hindered or delayed decision or create confusion in the public and created space for the politicians not to act, like in the case of climate change. You are also a pioneer, I would say, in the quantification of climate change consensus, which is, I think the first paper was in 2004, if I'm not mistaken. And you have found a way to quantify the percentage of scientific papers that were in favor or against the current ideas, the current consensual ideas about climate change, which is that the climate is changing and the reason for those changes are human activities, namely the emissions of greenhouse gases. So this quantification, do you think this quantification was important for a more widely accepted, more general acceptance of climate change facts in the public arena?
Well, again, it's always very hard. Yeah, it's very hard to know exactly what the impact of your work is on other people or the general public. But certainly we have evidence to believe that this work has been important. We know from a variety of social scientific research that if people understand that there is a consensus on a scientific question, then they're much more likely to support political action or social action, or to take personal steps in their own lives to act upon that information. Whereas if people think there's no consensus or there's a big scientific debate going on, then they're less likely to support action on the issue. And this is very important because, as you suggested, people who don't want action then try to create the impression of a big scientific controversy. They create a social controversy, but they masquerade it as a scientific controversy because they understand that if you can create controversy, if you can create the appearance of scientific disagreement, then you can undermine support for action.
Do you think this strategy of quantifying the consensus on a scientific issue could be applied to other fields of science where there are some artificial controversies?
Yes, definitely. I think that, one of the things we sometimes hear people say is, oh, it's so hard, it's so difficult to know what scientists think because they're always arguing, and one scientist says X and another scientist says Y, and the whole thing is just so confusing. Well, it isn't really. I mean, sometimes it is. Some scientific debates are challenging intellectually, but it's usually not that hard to figure out what it is that scientists have to say. And one of the ways that a person could do that is the example that I developed of doing an analysis of the scientific literature to actually say, all right, if here's a claim, here's a statement, how many of the papers agree with that statement versus disagree? And that's what I did in my 2004 work. It wasn't that hard. I sometimes feel that I get much too much credit for it because it took a little while, but it wasn't nearly as hard as some other things I've done. It's a rather simple approach, really, but I think it can be powerful because it can lay to rest the question of what it is that scientists actually think and believe. And once you can do that, then you can distinguish between a scientific controversy versus a political controversy. And that's not to say that political controversy is necessarily illegitimate. It's simply to say that these things should be accurately characterized because depending upon what it is, we might have different responses to it.
But
we like, yes, you want to add something?
Can I just add, in 2004, which is interesting, climate science was already quite mature. Now, which means that we were already quite sure about what were the main ideas about climate change. Now we face a different situation, which is we have the COVID-19 science process live on TV, which means that the science is not still mature, and some people are watching the scientific process like a reality show to see which papers are published. Some of them are contradictory to each other. Some of them are even retracted, so they are retracted from the scientific publications where they are published. So this is a much more difficult situation to communicate. Would you agree?
Yes, I do. I think anytime we see a debate playing out in real time, where we're trying to develop a response at the same time that we're trying to develop scientific understanding, then obviously that's going to be more difficult. We also have an extremely high level of public interest in the issue, which leads to a very high level of journalists rushing to report on the latest finding. And as you say, if that finding doesn't hold up, it can give the impression of great confusion. But I still do think that many people exaggerate the scientific uncertainty, even to do with COVID-19. So I'm not denying that there is uncertainty. Of course, this is a novel virus, and anytime you have a novel pathogen, there will always be important questions about the pathogen, its virulence, its mechanisms of spreading. And yet, if we think about the public health response, we know that public health officials were already warning before COVID-19 ever hit that there was a risk of the emergence of a novel respiratory virus, and that most countries were not adequately prepared to deal with it. And we also know that although this virus, every virus is distinct, no two viruses are exactly the same, but many of the features that have led to successful containment in some countries are the basic strategies that you would use to contain any respiratory virus, which is to say, we know a fair amount about viruses. We know quite a lot about respiratory viruses. And what we know from earlier pandemics and earlier outbreaks can be applied to this one. And where it has been applied, it has made a difference. And so I think there's a tendency, particularly among journalists, to focus on what we don't know, because that seems to be where the story is, as opposed to saying, well, you know, if we look at the past 100 years of epidemics, pandemics, new viruses, you know, we actually have the basis for saying some things with a pretty high degree of confidence. But that's not a very exciting story to say, you know, we kind of know what we're doing here. Is less exciting to say than to say, oh my God, we don't know what this is. We don't know how to react to it. Scientists are arguing. You know, that's a more exciting, a more emotional, a more dramatic story.
Yes, we like transparency. Our societies, contemporary societies, like transparency, and so all this, even these controversies, come to the public. And you touched the role of the media. I myself, I'm a journalist, and so what we want is to know what is happening. Why are they arguing? Okay, so in this sense, do you think there is a lack of communication from the scientists? They are not communicating well what they are doing? And they want to be so transparent that we get aware of these arguments, and perhaps the people will not trust. This will affect the trust in science.
Yes, I think that's right. And I think we've seen a number of different things taking place in this particular case. And it's not exactly the same in different countries. So here in the United States, we have the particular pathology of a political leadership that is anti-science, that denies basic fundamental scientific understanding, and is putting pressure on scientific organizations, for example, the Food and Drug Administration, to approve a vaccine quickly, in a way that has undermined public trust, because the public wants to know that the vaccine will only be approved if it's safe and effective. But now we have reason to believe that the Food and Drug Administration is under inappropriate political pressure. So that's a specific pathology of the United States, which I don't think has been reproduced very much in other countries, although maybe I'm wrong, and then I'm sad if that's the case. In addition, though, there are other problems that have made this difficult to communicate, not just in the United States. And one thing I'm thinking of in particularly is the World Health Organization. So as you know, early on in this pandemic, the World Health Organization did not advise ordinary people to wear masks. Rather, the opposite. They said that ordinary people should not wear masks. Now, if we look at why they did that, what we now know is that the main reason that they said that was that there was a shortage of personal protective equipment for essential workers, doctors, nurses, etc. And the World Health Organization was afraid that if they said to people, well, masks may help you prevent the spread of this disease, that people would rush out and hoard those masks, and they wouldn't be available for the people who needed it most urgently. Now, that was a communication failure. It's my personal opinion that the World Health Organization should have simply said that. They simply should have said, we think masks probably help, but right now there is an urgent need to protect those masks for the healthcare workers, and we are pleading with people, pleading with the public, do not go out and get masks right away. Please wait. Now, we don't know what would have happened had they spoken honestly about that, and maybe they were right, because we saw here in the United States, people did hoard hand sanitizer, people did hoard toilet paper. So sometimes the public does behave in bad ways, but I guess I think it still would have been better overall, to be honest, because then subsequently when the World Health Organization said, well, yes, probably ordinary people really should be wearing masks, it looked as if they had reversed their views, when in reality, I don't think they really reversed their views, but they communicated in a way that made it seem as if they had.
The point is, when someone tells me, do this, and a few months later they tell me the opposite, how can I trust the guy?
Exactly. It's not a good look.
Yes. One thing I read, it was your opinion that scientists must become better communicators. They have to explain to us not just what they know, but how they know it. What do you mean by this?
Well, first of all, I should say when I say scientists should become better communicators, I don't necessarily mean all scientists. I understand that most scientists want to do science. That's why they became scientists, and many scientists are not particularly comfortable in the public eye. And I think that's fine. I don't think we should demand that all scientists have to, be in public. But I think that some component of the scientific community needs to be involved, because if we don't, then we see that public confusion and public distrust grow. So why do we need to explain not just what we know, but how we know it? Well, this is based in part on my own experience communicating with audiences in many different places. But there's also social science research to support this as well. If you simply say to people, here are the facts, this is how it is, X, Y, and Z, that's kind of insulting to your audience. It's kind of condescending. It can feel diminishing to the audience that they're simply being told, you have to trust this because I say so. That can appear quite arrogant. But if you explain to people, well, here's what we've concluded, and here's why. Let me walk you through the evidence. Let me explain to you what the process looks like. That's a much more respectful position. And I believe that that kind of respectful approach is more likely to win friends and influence people. No one likes to be disrespected. So if we can speak with the public, whoever the public are, diverse publics, if we can speak with people in a respectful way to say, yeah, this can be confusing, but I think I can explain it to you in a way that you can understand, I think we're more likely to get a meaningful response, or more likely to get the response that we would like from our audiences.
So the scientists, they know, and they communicate what they know, okay, because they know. But on the other hand, they must explain how they reach those conclusions, those results. That idea of the scientist that knew everything, he was in the tower, the ivory tower, is gone forever? Or, but on the other hand, if the people think, okay, that scientists are common persons, are like us. So again, how can we trust them? They make mistakes. Because you mentioned the arrogance. We risk falling into the arrogance of scientism that Pierre Bourdieu talked about. What is the balance, the possible balance for the scientist? Shall he tell us, no, I know this because I did my research and I reached those conclusions? Or shall he be more humble and tell the people, okay, perhaps I'm wrong, I'm open to discussion? And so this is a paradox, perhaps, no?
Well, I think you're right that it is a bit of a paradox. And I think it's certainly true that many scientists are afraid to discuss the errors, the mistakes, because they're afraid that it will make the scientific process seem less worthy of respect. So I do think there is a tension here, but I think that most of what we know from social science leans in the direction of the honest appraisal, because we have a lot of good evidence from social science research that people are more likely to trust a message if they trust the messenger, if they see the messenger as a trustworthy person. And someone who's honest about their mistakes, who can say, well, here's how the process works. And let me explain, here's an example where we actually did make a mistake. We got something wrong, and here's how we fixed it. I think that's a much better basis for building trust and appearing to be an honest, open, trusted messenger than if you simply say, no, I'm never going to talk about the mistakes because that, I can't ever be seen to admit a mistake in public. And if you think about it, what I'm suggesting is really no different than what scientists do in science, right? So in a scientific conference, in a scientific workshop, in scientific papers, scientists spend a lot of time pointing out each other's mistakes, sometimes admitting their own mistakes, trying to rectify them. I mean, this is where we started our conversation at the top of the hour, that the whole process of science is about identifying and correcting mistakes. And that's the argument for why science is trustworthy, not because scientists are perfect, because that would not be a credible claim, but to say that they have good methods for correcting error. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that scientists could share that with the public. They could share with the public what it is that they do in private and say, this is what our process looks like. And it turns out to be a pretty good process. And we have lots of good examples where scientists have, in fact, honestly corrected mistakes. And we have a better understanding of this problem now that we do.
So
If I can give one example,
yeah.
One of my favorite examples of this, like a real life example from some work I did years ago. So my early work was on the history of the development of the theory of plate tectonics in earth science. And as part of that, I did a project where I invited about 20 scientists who had worked on the theory to write essays for a volume in which we would really look at this question, how did scientists figure this out? Because it really went very strongly against what they had previously believed. And one of the scientists involved, a French scientist, Xavier Le Pichon, told this wonderful story of how in 1968 he had just finished his PhD dissertation. So he's in graduate school. He's worked for years on this major piece of work that is supposed to launch his scientific career. And then he goes to a scientific conference where someone presents some new data. And he goes home that night and he says to his wife, pour me a stiff drink because everything I have written in my PhD thesis is wrong. And the next day he went back to work and started fixing it. And I just think that's a beautiful story because it's kind of heartbreaking. I mean, it makes you appreciate what it would be like to be a scientist in that moment and then to say, okay, tonight I have a stiff drink and tomorrow I get back to work.
But for the scientist, that is perhaps good, this a new start, it's okay. But for the public, it's a failure.
Well, it's a failure if it's left uncorrected, but it's not a failure if it ends up yielding a better, more powerful theory.
So would you think that if people understand better the scientific method, this would help for the trust in science and in scientists? It's this
Yeah, well, I can't prove it. And of course, we'd have to do more research to test that hypothesis. But I've certainly found in my own work, when I spend time discussing scientific methods, scientific processes, explaining how climate scientists have demonstrated or proven that the world is really heating up and it really is caused by greenhouse gases, I find people are very, very receptive to that. And often people thank me afterwards and they say things like, I wish you'd been my professor in college. I one time had a US senator say that to me, and that was a very nice moment.
You wanted to ask something about this or comment, David?
Yeah, I mean,
From your experience here in Portugal as well, when you teach you give classes for scientists and also for the public in general about science communication, how do you feel this?
Well, I think sometimes people, again, like Professor Naomi, I cannot prove this. This is also from my experience. I think most people, we are not climate change denialists or COVID-19 denialists or flat earthers, which I think they are. I think I would ask you also about that in the end, about this kind of personalities, I would say. But I do think that sometimes most people value science, think that science is a very important thing, but they see it like a kind of magic box where some ideas and results come out, and everything is possible. And if everything is possible, also pseudoscience is possible. So I think it's very important to communicate the scientific process, not only the scientific method, but how the process, it is a very robust process which does not depend on not having failures or mistakes. It actually, after a certain time, when a certain number of scientific researchers in different countries all research on around the same theme, we get to have a reliable knowledge about that theme. I would like to ask Professor Oreskes, you mentioned social sciences a couple of times. Do you think there is a difference in trust on social science and natural sciences by the public? that people trust differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, there probably is research on that I haven't looked at closely. I mean, I think it would probably be safe to say that many people do have an impression of the physical sciences, chemistry, biology, physics as being, chemistry and physics as being sort of, harder scientists, more robust, more reliable than social sciences like economics or sociology. But why they think that exactly is not entirely clear, because of course we know that physicists make mistakes too. So I think that would be an interesting thing to look at more closely and to try to understand what are the conditions that lead people to believe in or trust particular sciences. Because before climate change denial became a thing, we might have thought that people would not doubt climate science. After all, this is physical science. It's based on basic physical principles about how the heat is transferred in the atmosphere, which is a basic physical question. There's no real politics or values associated with how heat is transferred, between the troposphere and the stratosphere. So you might have thought that this would be the sort of science that people would trust, and it wouldn't be the kind of science like psychology that people might view as untrustworthy. But in fact, we see this massive distrust. And so that's what tells us that it's not really about the character of the science. It's about the social conditions that have led people to be skeptical or distrusting of science in particular areas like climate change.
So as for, if you think about climate change denialism or the flat earthers, and in the trust of science, do you think there are lost cases that we simply should not address as science communicators because these beliefs are so important to their self-image and sometimes to their sense of belonging to a group like a tribe or a religion? So do you think there are lost cases in the trusting in science?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that there are some people that no matter how much data, no matter how much evidence, no matter how patiently you explain the scientific arguments, they will not be persuaded because, as you say, they're too entrenched in an ideological position, or their rejection of the science is tied up with their personal identity in some way. And those people are probably lost causes. However, those people don't exist in a vacuum. And so the way I view it is this: I sometimes will give a public lecture where someone will stand up and ask a question that's clearly a denialist question. They'll ask it in a very confrontational tone of voice, or they'll have a very confrontational body language, or they'll use language that I recognize as coming from right-wing, ideologically driven sources. But I still always try to answer the question to the best of my ability. And I always try to answer it as much as possible in a respectful way, because what I know is that even though that person standing in front of me may be a lost cause, there are other people in the audience who are not lost causes. Other people in the audience who maybe have heard the same argument, or maybe think, well, yeah, how come? Well, how do we know? Or why not that? And so when I answer, I'm not just answering for the individual who posed the question, but I'm answering for anyone else who might be listening at the same time.
Again, still about this difference between natural sciences and the social sciences, do you think that the public values better the results of natural sciences, and when they talk about health, for instance, or about technology we can use, instead of some sociological results, because of course, this deals with the funding. People would accept more if the funding goes to someone who gives results that we can use than ideas and then social sciences. Do you think this is important also because of funding?
Yes, this is an excellent question and very, very important, because I think most scientists make the assumption that hard data, what they call hard data, numbers, facts, are what persuade people. And therefore, it's appropriate that we should focus funding efforts and human efforts on creating robust data, information, numbers about X and Y. So for example, if we take the example of using wearing a mask to help prevent the spread of COVID-19. Many scientists that I know would say, well, what we need to do is prove that the masks work. I mean, we saw this in the discussion about masks in the United Kingdom. We need to have a robust, randomized clinical trial to prove the efficacy of masks. And if we can do that, then people will wear masks. Well, we know that that's totally fallacious. We know that when people don't wear masks, it's not because they don't have an RCT to defend it. It's because they don't want to wear a mask. And why don't they want to wear a mask? Well, we know here in the United States, and we have good evidence of this, a lot of men are much more likely to reject wearing masks than women. Why is that? It's not, well, maybe it's because women are smarter and pay more attention to data, and maybe women are smarter and understand the data. You know, we could entertain that hypothesis, but I would suggest that it's not that. It's because a lot of men think that it's a sign of weakness to wear a mask, because men associate their masculinity with strength, and that includes physical strength. And they think that if they wear a mask, it's admitting that they're weak. We see the same thing with motorcycle helmets. Now, more men than women ride motorcycles, but we know that when women ride motorcycles, they're much more likely to wear a helmet than men. Again, we could say this is because women are more intelligent, because anybody with half a brain would like to protect that brain. But again, we know that it's tied up with notions of machismo, of masculine gender identity. So if you want to understand that, and if you want to find a way to persuade a man that he really should wear a mask, you're not going to do it by having a randomized clinical trial of the effects of mask wearing. But you might do it if you did social science research into why men define masculinity in these ways, or what kind of an argument would be persuasive to a man that might be different than the kind of argument that would be persuasive to a woman. That's exactly what social science is all about. And we have so many examples, not just masks and motorcycle helmets, but smoking and nutrition. I mean, the list goes on and on of places where we could save lives and we could make men healthier if we understood better the psychological and the sociological and the cultural obstacles to them doing things that are actually good for them. And that will not be solved by more natural science, but it could be solved by more social science.
But the question is, funding goes more for natural sciences than for social sciences, right? Because people want results, want things to touch.
Yeah, and I think that's based on a misunderstanding of what kinds of results are powerful and efficacious. So, yeah, I mean, if any funders are on this, listening to this, I think this is an extremely important issue. And I wish that funding agencies would, in fact, pay more attention to what we know about human behavior and the ways in which cultural forces influence human behavior that then have tangible consequences for public health, for safety, for the spread of disease, etc.
Let me tell you a story that happened with the French President François Mitterrand. Once he was visiting CNRS, and they were telling, oh, here you have some researchers, and there you find more researchers, and another room with researchers. And then he asked, okay, I have met several researchers. Can I meet some finders? Someone who finds something. And this is what we are talking.
Yes, I think I can, if I'm allowed to give an example. If you think about this year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry about gene editing, so I think hard sciences or natural sciences give us the possibility to alter the genome of a human being throughout generations, replacing natural selection. I think in order to the society as a whole to cope with that, I think we need social sciences and humanities to cope with the ethical and the social issues that arise from these challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the perfect way of summarizing that is to say that natural sciences can tell us what we can do, but it's only the social sciences and the humanities and the arts that tell us what we should do.
Let me take again the climate change issue. Politicians do not listen to scientists, but they listen to Greta Thunberg, a young girl, a teenager, not a scientist. How do you look at this situation?
Well, that's an interesting one. I mean, it's not entirely clear that politicians really have listened to Greta Thunberg, because they've certainly listened to her speak, But if we look at their actions, I think what we see in most places in North America, in Europe, in Australia, in Japan, that the actions of the governments are still being very much dominated by the controlling power of the fossil fuel industry. And so the real question is, how do we shift that? How do we break that power? And that's where climate becomes a political issue. So again, we can build the most careful climate models in the world. We can produce reports. Scientists have produced reports. I mean, we're up to the 7th report now from the IPCC. So we can have all the natural scientific data in the world, but if we don't address the power structures, we won't get the social and economic change that we need. And I think that's the key point that reinforces what we were just saying about natural science is extremely important for us, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And to have a sufficient solution, we have to understand the political, the social, and the cultural obstacles to change.
So, but sometimes we need, the scientists need personalities like Greta Thunberg to attract attention to an issue. Is it useful, and how do scientists react to this? We are talking and nobody listens to us, and then someone who is not a scientist is invading our universe. So,
the same happened previously with Al Gore, I would say, with the inconvenient truth.
Yes.
Yeah, I think 40 years ago, a lot of climate scientists might have been resentful. Now I think most climate scientists are just so desperate to see politicians listen to anyone that I think, most of the scientists I knew were pretty thrilled by Greta, especially her Senate testimony here in the United States when she was asked what her testimony was, and she took the IPCC the 1.5 degree special report, and she said, "Here is my testimony." And she put it on the table. That was a pretty great moment for scientists as well as for her.
Okay, now a different question, more general. In your opinion, what is the truth in science? What is the truth? It's this permanent
what do you
truth?
Mean, what is the truth? No. Well, I mean, this is something, of course, I discuss in my book. The notion of permanent truth is not one that any scientist, in my opinion, should subscribe to. Occasionally, you do hear scientists use that language. I think it's very mistaken. The history of science is complicated, but there are a few things that stand out absolutely clearly that no historian of science would challenge, in my opinion, as far as I know. And that is that science is a process, not an event. It's a journey, not a destination. So it's a learning process. And by definition, any learning process means that over time, we will learn new things. And we should view that as a good thing. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's something to welcome and embrace. And as we do more research, we collect more data, we develop new methodologies, we will learn new things that sometimes cause us to rethink what we've thought in the past. And that process means that we can never really view any truth that we have now as permanent, because even though some of what we know may turn out to be permanent, we have no way of judging which are the truths that will hold up and which are the truths that will perish. And so we have to view the entire thing as a process, and to view what we know now as the best we are able to do right now. And the way I view it then, some people say, well, how can you make a decision if you don't believe that this is the truth? And the answer is, this is the best information we have right now. And so it makes sense to make decisions based on that best information, but also to be flexible and to realize that we may change our understanding of things in the future. So I always like to say life is a matter of adaptive management. I mean, even in our ordinary lives, we change our thoughts about things when we get new information, and that's true in science as well.
What is important is to explain why do we change our opinions, right?
Yes, well, that gets back to what we were saying about not just what we know, but how we know it. Because if scientists are going to change their views, it's very important to explain that so it doesn't seem arbitrary. Because otherwise, and this gets back to the World Health Organization example of the masks, if you don't explain it, then it can seem arbitrary. And then it can seem like you don't know what you're talking about. And that's an invitation for people to stop listening. But if you explain it and say, well, we have some new studies, and here's what the new studies show, and this is leading us to revise our previous advice, most people are smart enough to understand that. And it's not an insult to the intelligence of politicians or the general public to say, we have new information and we'd like to tell you what that new information signifies.
Yes, if I may comment, I totally agree with Professor Oreskes. I would just like to highlight that although there is, of course, uncertainty in science, and that the truth is not actually a scientific concept, but more like I would say a religious one, I would argue that not all things are on equal footing, because we are different levels of certainty on different matters. So, as an example, as two examples, recently a Portuguese scientist working in the UK found out that there is a phosphine molecule in Venus, which is an indicator that might have been life in Venus. So we are not sure if there was life in Venus. There is an uncertainty that if there was ever some biological being in Venus. That's one thing, but we are pretty sure that the Earth is round. So we have there are different levels of uncertainty. So the principles of thermodynamics are we are highly sure about those. So I think there are different levels. So we cannot say that. So I think there is a risk when communicated to the public that saying that there is always uncertainty in science, which is true. But I think we should add that the uncertainty is not equal in all matters. It's so I might ask. Yes.
Well, I just said, no, I agree completely. That's a very important point. It's not a matter of we know or we don't know. There can be ranges of understanding. The French philosopher Pierre Duhem wrote about that very, very eloquently. And actually, thermodynamics was the example he gave. He said, if I do an experiment and the experiment fails, then I know that something in my system is wrong, but I don't know what it is. So how do I decide what it is? And he says, well, there are certain things that are so well established that we're very unlikely to discard them. And thermodynamics, conservation of energy and conservation of mass was the example he gave of something that is so well known that we're extremely unlikely to question it, but we might look for errors or mistakes or problems in other parts of our knowledge system.
So there is this uncertainty links with the risk of accepting scientific truth. I read something that you mentioned some time ago about what Pascal, the French philosopher, can you please remember us about that?
Sure. Well, as long as we're discussing French philosophers. So Pascal had a very famous intervention centuries ago, which has come to be known as Pascal's wager. And in modern terms, it would be what we call the type 1 or the type 2 error. So what is the risk of believing that something's true that turns out to be false versus believing something false that turns out to be true? Now, Pascal was particularly interested in the problem of the existence of God. And so he concludes it's much safer to believe in God, even if it turns out God does not exist, than to disbelieve, because in the second case, I end up burning in hell. So we can take that approach to any problem and say, well, if we're not 100% sure of the answer, if this is a problem that we can never be 100% sure, such as the existence of God, where are the risks greater? And so I make this argument in the book. In fact, the book closes with a little cartoon, a little illustration. I'll see if I can find it here, but a cartoon that tries to articulate this idea. And the idea then is that if climate scientists are right in what they think about the climate system and we ignore it, then we are in very, very serious trouble. But if it turns out they're wrong and we spend money cleaning up pollution, well, then we just end up with a better world anyway. So that tells us that in that case, we're much better off listening to the scientists. I'm sorry, I can't find where the cartoon is in my book. Oh, here it is. Okay, here we go. Well, you might be able, maybe you can edit this into the talk, but this is the cartoon where the speaker in the audience, he's a little bit angry and belligerent. He says, well, what if this is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing?
We talked about some paradox earlier. Let me now talk about another paradox. We've never had so many people, so high percentage of the population attending school and graduating from college. However, mistrust in science and in scientists is, I think it's growing. I don't know, perhaps I'm wrong. How is this possible? It's the educational system that is failing?
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think that education does instill in many people a healthy skepticism, and a certain amount of skepticism, a certain amount of distrust is legitimate. I'm not saying the book is not an argument for blind faith in science. It's an argument for informed trust in the warranted claims of scientific communities. So the idea that a more educated population would be somewhat more skeptical, I think is fine. That really doesn't trouble me at all. One thing we do know in the United States, again, I'm more familiar with the data here than in Europe, but there has been a decline in the trust of institutions overall in the United States as compared to, say, the 1950s or 60s. But one of the things we see is that the decline in trust in science is actually much less than the decline in trust in other organizations like government or the media. So yes, there's been some scientists have taken a bit of a hit, but actually much less than many other organizations. I have seen some data in Europe. The data are different in different countries. One thing that I do remember from a study I read about Europe was that in France, the most trusted group of people are local government officials. And I think that's incredibly interesting, and it would be very interesting to do more research to understand, what is it that those local government officials in France do to generate that high level of public trust.
Who do you think is more dangerous, for scientists? Is public opinion, the media, or some industry and economic power?
Oh, well, I think that's pretty obvious. I think it's the latter and politicians who do their bidding. So if we look at the evidence here in the United States, we have tremendous evidence that the generation of distrust and confusion about scientific matters primarily comes from organized, systematic, structural disinformation campaigns funded by industries who are fighting against regulation, and the politicians who they fund and work with. Many people do listen to what politicians say, and many people follow what the leaders of their political party says. So when Donald Trump says that climate change is a hoax, that deeply influences the people who have voted for him. And that's why it's so upsetting and so incredibly irresponsible. When politicians repeat anti-scientific claims, that can be very damaging and very influential. And I think we have pretty good evidence that here in the United States, at least, that's been far more influential than other potential sources of confusion that we've seen.
And is it possible? How can we fight that? How can we deal with it?
Well, it's very difficult. One of the reasons this is a challenge is because it is very difficult to deal with disinformation. And anyone who's ever studied propaganda knows that it's extremely difficult to defang propaganda. But I think there are some things we can do. I think the most important thing we can do is to talk about it. As I said when Merchants of Doubt first came out, and people would say, well, why did you write this book? And I said, well, we all know that mold grows in dark places. If we can expose disinformation for what it is, and particularly if we can explain to people, this is not a scientific debate, this is a disinformation campaign, that can be effective. And in fact, we now have research. John Cook at George Mason University has done research on this, also Stephen Lewandowski in the United Kingdom at Bristol University, that if you can show people that this is disinformation, it makes people angry because nobody wants to be the victim of disinformation. Nobody wants to be on the losing end of a con game. And if you can show people that this really is a con game, that can be an effective way to defang the disinformation. So it's very important for us to talk about it. It's very important for us to name it, to call it out for what it is, and not to be afraid to say this is disinformation. In my experience, many scientists are afraid to say that because it feels political, it feels confrontational. Scientists don't want to be political, they don't want to be confrontational, at least, maybe in their science it's okay to be confrontational, but they don't want to be politically confrontational. But I think in this case we have to be, because if we aren't, then we just contribute to the confusion, we contribute to the cacophony, and people don't know what to think.
Yes, because scientists are also citizens, and they have some social responsibilities. Don't you agree?
Absolutely, we all do.
So you have mentioned disinformation campaigns now and in your book, Merchants of Doubt, that goes back to a few decades ago, like the tobacco industry. So some people nowadays blame the social networks for the disinformation. So do you think there is a very important difference between disinformation and how it spreads, and it's lent before and after social networks, or it's just the same thing in the different media?
Well, we know that social media didn't create this problem because it existed before. And in the work I'm doing now with Eric Conway, we're actually looking at propaganda campaigns from the 1930s that mainly used the medium of radio to propagate the disinformation, the propaganda. So I think we know that any kind of media, particularly electronic media, whether it's radio, television, film, can be used to spread disinformation. And of course, during the wars, World War I and World War II, radio was the main means of propaganda dissemination. However, I think we also have evidence that social media has made it worse. We do have research, people have done work on how disinformation spreads on Twitter and Facebook. And one of the things there was a study that was in Science recently in which they showed how people are more likely to retweet a false claim than a true one. And the interpretation that has been given for this is the idea that people are more likely to retweet and share things that are surprising. And so the truth is often not surprising. It's often what we kind of already know. But if somebody makes a claim, a startling claim about something, quite stunning and outrageous, well, because it's surprising, it captures people's attention and they're more likely to spread it. So there is a kind of psychological reason why disinformation would spread more quickly in social media than actual real information. And that would happen even if no dark forces are behind it. Now we add to it the fact that we know there are dark forces behind it. We know there is the deliberate propagation of disinformation on social media. And this is why the issue about the regulation of social media is so important, because if the social media networks themselves won't take steps to control the spread of disinformation, hate language, things like this, then we do have a question as society about what steps would be reasonable to take to deal with that question.
Do you think that this COVID pandemic is worth a book like this, White Rust Science, or a revision, a second edition or so, another chapter? Do you think, or is it too soon to think about it?
Well, actually, it's funny you asked, because my publisher is going forward with a paperback edition that is coming out in April. And they did ask me to write a preface, a new preface for the new edition. And I have done that, and it is about COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So I think it's too soon to have a very detailed analysis of what's happened. But I do think we have enough information to be able to say at least a little something about the role of trust in science in the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, I think we are approaching the end of our conversation, but I would still ask you a message for the scientists and a message for the public about this trust in science.
Well, for scientists, what I'd like to say is to be kind. I think that a lot of scientists have trouble communicating to the public because they get frustrated. They want the public to know more than they do, and they find it hard to communicate with people who don't know what they think they should already know. And so my message to scientists is to try to be kind, to appreciate that most people in the public are not scientists. In America, a typical American citizen has only had science education up to the level of high school chemistry, so that would be the equivalent of O levels in England. I don't know what the equivalent would be in Portugal, but this would be like about age 15. So this is a very rudimentary level of scientific education, and it's not their fault. It's the world we live in, and so we should be kind and compassionate to those people and understand that we have to come up with explanations that can make sense to people whose scientific education ended when they were 15 years old. For the general public, what I would say is something that one of my students said to me when I was working on this book and shared a draft of it with my students. She looked me in the eye and she said, "So what you're saying, if I get this right, is that scientists need to be better communicators and we need to be better listeners. And I thought that was a very nice summary that, you know, there's responsibility on both sides, and both sides can take on that responsibility and try to find some nice place to meet in the middle.
Professor Naomi Oreskes, thank you very much. Has been a very interesting conversation we kept here. Thank you also, David. And Porquê confiar na ciência? Foi o tema de hoje. Recordo que a tradução do livro Porquê Confiar na Ciência deverá estar disponível no início de 2021. É publicada pela editora Gradiva, apoiada pela Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. E por hoje chegamos ao fim. Daqui a uma semana voltamos para falar de envelhecimento e da influência do stress e da genética nesse processo de envelhecimento. Será mais uma sessão do Mês da Ciência e da Educação.